I have many great memories of attending Columbia University in the 1980s and 1990s. I grew up a very proud Columbian, as my dad was the class of 1960 and the editor of the Columbia Daily Spectator, the school newspaper. When I attended, I founded a Jewish fraternity. I was president of the Hillel. I absolutely loved it. One of my favorite parts was restarting a kosher deli. Actually been my dad's dream, but he lived vicariously through me. Every day I would go in and work the lunch shift and the mad crush of people coming to get their sandwiches. And then at the end, I'd heat up 2 bagel dogs for my own lunch. Anyone know what a bagel dog is? Yeah, Dave, what is it? Okay. Dave, like I, lived on them in college. They're hot dogs entirely encased in bagel dough. Okay, those are fancy ones. I knew from the simple ones, no sticks. Now that I think about it, I don't know if you experienced it, probably not the healthiest choice for lunch. Probably not good for my stomach either. Actually, I'm not recommending that any of you eat them. Just don't. But they were very convenient because they were entirely kind of in one piece. You didn't have to worry about, your sandwich kind of leaking out. I could easily grab them from my deli and head over 50 feet to Hamilton Hall, where I could eat surreptitiously in the back, dipping my hot dogs into the Gulden's mustard, hoping that the smell did not overtake the lecture on Aristotle or whatever we were discussing. My memories of that hall, of Hamilton Hall, were entirely good. I got to meet my dean, Jack Greenberg, the famous civil rights lawyer there. I took these wonderful courses in philosophy in its hallowed halls, and I could look out the windows at the lawns where I would play frisbee and hang out. Those memories have been a bit overshadowed over the last few months and weeks. First, the anti-Israel protests, the chants supporting Gaza, which sometimes led into supporting the Hamas murderers. And then a kind of slide into anti-Semitic hate speech and intimidation of Jews. And then the Gaza tent encampments. And finally, the assault on Hamilton Hall, where that hall was taken over, windows smashed, offices ransacked, and even a facility worker who was detained by the violent protesters for a number of hours. Now, I'm a pretty big supporter of rallies and protests and vigils, and I've attended dozens and dozens of them and even organized many of them for Soviet Jews, for Israel, against the horrors in Darfur, against gun violence, against anti-Semitism, against homophobia, against Islamophobia, against racism and police brutality. Now, before October 7th last year, I had been to a number of protests and rallies against the Israeli government and its proposals to change their Supreme Court. I even spoke at one of those. My Rosh Hashanah sermon was about the need for Israel to remain a Jewish and democratic state, and how its extremist, I would say racist and intolerant government was headed in the absolute wrong direction. Since October 7th, things have changed. We've held vigils for the victims of October 7th here, rallies for Israel. They've been here at Amuna, in our local area, in Boston, in Washington, D.C. And of course, since October 7th, we've seen many pro-Palestinian rallies, some of which I have no issues with. But there's a big difference between a rally or vigil and a demonstration whose rhetoric turns to hate. When it moves from being anti-Israel to being pro-terrorist. When it moves from being anti-Zionist to calling for the deaths of Zionists. When it moves from concern for Gazans to the demonization of Jews. And sadly, we've witnessed exactly that progression. Free speech on campuses should not include encouraging violence. So let's turn to the Torah for some insights. As Brooke introduced it so thoughtfully, Parshat Aharei contains several themes and rules that help us live lives of holiness. The reading opens by remembering a tragedy, the tragedy of the death of Aaron's sons, Aharei Mot. And what happens after that? The text states that Moses is to tell his brother, Aaron, that he's not supposed to enter a certain sacred space because God says, I appear in that space, in what is described as a cloud over the cover. Be'anan era'eh ala kaporet. This has always struck me as a hard image to wrap my hands around. What exactly is this cloud? Why is God in it? Why is God in this mist? I find it much easier to relate to other images, like the cloud of fire that led the Israelites, guided them, protected them as they journeyed through the wilderness. Now, clouds, at least real ones, can provide good things. Shade on a hot, sunny day, rain to areas that need it. But clouds also mean something else. They represent the bridge between the visible and the invisible. They are nuanced. They are complicated. And they are certainly not clear. Now, our rabbis picked up on this. The Jerusalem Talmud, which was codified and edited about 1,500 years ago in the land of Israel, teaches that clouds, ananim, are helpful to be the word anavim. They do a little play on the word ananim and anavim, right? We are supposed to be humble, anav. And anavim represents humility. What's the connection? The rabbis say that an anan, a cloud, represents abundance. You can understand this in an area that had very little rain, right? The cloud was going to rain, be something abundant. And if you feel a sense of abundance, then you're able to approach people differently, with a sense of humility, with a sense of humility that leads to kindness, that leads to openness, appreciating that every person has wisdom and has things that they can share with you that are important. Anavim and ananim. These clouds help us maybe approach each other with a spirit of generosity, maybe treating each other with more kindness. Maybe we listen to each other a little bit more. We could certainly use more listening. There's another teaching about clouds that I love in the tradition. The Torah states, right, that during the 40 years of wandering from Egypt to the land of Israel, the Israelites lived in Sukkot. Now, what are Sukkot? They were booths, which of course I never knew what a booth was, but it's a hut. They lived in huts. But Rabbi Akiva, our great rabbi and sage from 1,800 years ago, teaches that they were not literal huts, right? Why would they live in literal huts that were open to the elements for 40 years? He sees them as divine clouds of glory, ananei hakavod, meaning that the Israelites were surrounded and bathed in this spiritual space, protected and guided by it. But of course, like the sukkah, it is not totally protected. Clouds, this divine space, like clouds, are ephemeral. They reveal the nuances of existence. Now, I see the time that we are living in very much like this parasha. Like the deaths of Aaron's sons, the Jewish people suffered an unfathomable tragedy and trauma on October 7th, as Sydney was just speaking about, and its aftermath has brought continued suffering to Gazans and to Israelis. But the image, the image of the cloud can be helpful. It brings us a message of nuance and complexity. It brings us something about how we should be and what we need now. We need conversations, right? We need to understand that we need something different than what we hear being yelled about on television or social media. Discussions over demonstrations. And on the first day of Pesach, we were treated to a wonderful talk by Melanie Lidman, an AP journalist in Israel, and someone who grew up here, the daughter of Marcy and Ed Lidman. She challenged us. She said, try to find places and sources where you don't normally get your news. She said, try to find something beyond what you normally rely upon to learn from. And so, heeding her advice, I challenged myself to step out of my echo chamber. I listened to more and more Palestinian perspectives over the last 2 weeks, and they were hard to take in. I had a long conversation with Israelis who are on the right wing of the political spectrum. I heard their pain and loss and had a better understanding of their perspective, even if I disagreed with that. While they had, I think, pretty much given up on the possibility of peace, I'm not willing to. My son Aharei attended a dialogue between pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian students at his university, and he was really surprised to hear that the pro-Palestinian students did not actually have any of the history and complexity of this moment. They had never heard of the peace process. They had never heard of the Oslo Accords. They never heard of any of the details, even in the last few years and decades. There have been many demonstrations and slogans, but little listening and little learning. Imagine how different the last 7 months could have played out if a group of Palestinians had come up to a group of Jewish students on October 7th to demonstrate their sympathy. And then the Jewish students had come to them and reciprocated in the days and weeks that followed. And imagine if then a dialogue, they could have entered into that space over the horrors that both sides were experiencing during this time. If there's one thing that's central to Judaism, it's that we remember that we don't have to remain in a tragedy. We remember them, as we will this Sunday night, remembering the victims of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and the following Sunday night, as we remember those who died on October 7th, as well as all those who were victims of terror and died in Israel's wars. But beyond memory is hope. In our tradition, we never, ever lose sight of hope. We never stop dreaming of peace. Judaism teaches that we can always imagine a different tomorrow, one of dialogue over divisiveness, over conversation over conflict, one of love over loathing, one of peace, especially during a time of war. Peace can help us bring home the hostages like Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who staffed an Israel trip with our local Gann Academy just a couple of years ago, and some of our own students got to know the wonderful person that he is. The video that came out last week shows that he is alive, although clearly suffering. And it's a clarion call to exert as much pressure as we can on Hamas and on Israel to release him. So this Shabbat, let us recommit ourselves to peace. to understanding, to listening to perspectives we may not be open to. Let us use the image of clouds, the space where God resides, to maybe guide us a little bit more. A space of nuance, a space of dialogue where we can hold different narratives. Let us stand with our people and against the demonstrations of hate and anti-Semitism, but with open heart. That's where God dwells, and that's where we should as well. Now, in 10 days, I really hope to be at my daughter's graduation at the Columbia University campus. Not clear if it's going to be held. If it is, I hope it'll be peaceful. And if there's some people who want to protest respectfully, I support their right to do so in a manner that does not disrupt the proceedings. Maybe we'll even have some divine clouds over us, as long as they don't bring any rain. Shabbat Shalom.